Is God a loving God? Whatever it means to be those things, they are defined by God himself. So how can we then talk about the attributes of God? Both men and women are created in the image of God. While we may not know the full answer today, there will be a day. Okay, Cypress Bible Church, we are back on our question and answer series where we are answering questions from the sermon on Sunday. This video is on the topic of the attributes and nature of God. And here's the first question. In discussing the attributes and characteristics of God, I feel the need to raise the question of divine simplicity. Do you feel it is accurate to describe God as simple, in the sense that he is not composed of anything such as mercy or steadfast love, etc.? Would you agree with the statement that God is simply the essence of himself and he can't be broken down into anything more fundamental? If so, can you explain how the aspects of God's essence are revealed through his word while still maintaining this stance? All right, this is a great question, and it refers to the doctrine of divine simplicity. And if you're not familiar with that, it's simply asking the question, is God made up of many distinct parts, or is God simple in the sense that he is one essence? Okay, so maybe the best way to introduce this theological concept is to ask yourself the question, is God a loving God? And you might think, well, of course God's a loving God. But the way that question is framed assumes that there's a standard of love outside of God himself by which God is being judged. And that would violate the concept of divine simplicity. Because what does the Bible say? In 1 John 4, we learn that God himself is not a loving God. God himself is love. In other words, he is the definition, he is the standard of love. And so that would apply to all of God's attributes, his graciousness, his loving kindness, his justice, his wrath. Whatever it means to be those things, they are defined by God himself. We, by contrast, we can become more loving, but all we're saying in that is that we're becoming more like God. We're becoming more like the standard itself. So to answer the question, do we feel it's accurate to describe God as simple in the sense that he is not composed of anything, that he is one essence? Absolutely. So how can we then talk about the attributes of God? The answer to that question is that we're simply defining what it means in the most pure and essential sense of the word to be truthful, loving, etc. So hopefully that helps answer that question. Our second question is related. It goes like this. Mankind is created in the image of God. Angels are not. Please explain what defines the image of God. Maybe the best place to start in discussing this question is to talk about the word image itself. The Hebrew word for image is the word tselem, and it's an ancient concept, really built into the fabric of the ancient Near East. A king oftentimes conceived of himself and talked about himself as a god, or that he was the representative of God or the image of God. And so he was spoken in those terms. Oftentimes the word's actually translated idol. This is an idol. It's a representative of the God to whom the idol points. So if we remember back in the Hebrew Old Testament, the Israelites were not allowed to have idols. Why? Because the God of the Bible cannot be reduced down to this stone or wooden figurine. That's one reason. But there's actually kind of a deeper reason, and that is that God, Yahweh God, has already made images of himself in mankind. We learn that in Genesis chapter 1. So I'm going to read Genesis chapter 1 where we find this spoken of. This is in Genesis chapter 1, verse 26. It says, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the heavens, over the livestock, over the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. Okay, so there's been a lot of discussion on this. I mean, I think only the most simplistic readings would conclude that the image of God means the physical likeness of men. Some discussion has been made. Maybe this is referring to our emotional ability to have emotions, our ability to think, maybe in reference to our will. There's been some discussion of that. A couple of observations, I think, from the text itself, and I think that's where we need to kind of derive our primary understandings. I think you can make arguments for all those things, but maybe 2 or 3 observations from the text. Number one, it applies, whatever the image of God is, it applies to both male and female. Both men and women are created in the image of God. So it cannot be a masculine concept, it cannot be a feminine concept. It is a concept baked into the fabric of what it means to be human. That's one thing to notice from the text. A second is there's this concept of dominion, of ruling. So just like a king would rule over his domain, he would create the laws, he would say this is what is right and wrong. Interestingly, God gave mankind that same sort of responsibility to be his vice regents, to take his law and push it into the created order, to rule over the creation according to his laws. So man, I think there is an aspect of being made in the image of God where we are to rule and to represent him. We are clearly the only creatures on earth who are able to do that. And then I think finally, and maybe most interestingly to me, the nearest antecedent to what it means to be created in the image of God is actually this creative impulse of God. We, much like God, have this ability to create, to imagine, to make art, to build things, to build cities, to build cultures. And if you think about what the primary responsibility and work that God gave his image bearers to do, what was it to do? To till the ground, to create a garden, which would then create a family, which would then create cultures, which would then create civilizations. I mean, mankind was to exercise this creative impulse that is baked into the very center of who we are, to image forth God in the things that we do, in our art, in our science, in our discoveries, all these things. So I think that's kind of at the very center of what it means to be made in the image of God. If you want a good resource on this, I would actually recommend Dorothy Sayers. She is one of C.S. Lewis's contemporaries, and she wrote a book on the image of God, kind of making this argument that one of the main aspects of being created in the image of God is kind of this creative impulse. So I'd recommend that resource to you. Third question that we have under the same heading goes like this. Why? I understand and believe God's word, the grace of God as manifested through Jesus, the plan of salvation and assurance of spending eternity in the presence of the Savior. But stepping way back, why would God create and design a plan in which would include the fall of man, the repeated rescue of his chosen people, the sending of his one and only Son to die for the elect of his creation while tossing the rest of them into eternal torment? It's a remarkable script, and I know God has a part in this for me, but sometimes wonder why our loving God would put this together for his glory when he could simply raise up stones to glorify him. All right, so this is a great question, and I think a couple, maybe the first. Well, let me say this: we're not going to answer this entirely in a short little video like this. So there will always be mystery in this, but let me kind of frame a potential way of thinking about it by reminding ourselves that there are things that God cannot do. Okay, we think of God as being all omnipotent, all knowing, all these kinds of things, and we just think, oh, he can do anything he wanted, right? Of course he can do. He's God. Well, there are things, even according to the scriptures, that God cannot do. So, for example, we know that God cannot lie. The Bible's explicit about that. God cannot lie. That's something he cannot do. I think it's also reasonable and logical that God created the rules of logic. He cannot do things that are absurd. Like he could not create, for example, a round square. That is an absurd concept. And so God cannot do that. And I think it's also right to say that given who God is, given his perfection, given his glory, that there could not have been a better way to do things. Otherwise, he would have done it. So built into this question is kind of the assumption that there was a much easier way that God could have done it. He could have just made it such that the stones cry out and glorified him. And so why didn't God just do that? Well, the answer is that wouldn't have been for the maximum glory of God. We know for sure that the reason that things exist in their present form is for the glory of God. So we can just deduce by logic that whatever exists today is the best way and the maximal way and the only way that it could have been for the greatest glory of God and for our greatest good. So those things are kind of the entry level points of submission that we have to have as we enter into this question. I think the Bible kind of says three things on this topic. Number one, the fall of mankind was foreknown by God. Okay, this was not a surprise to him. This didn't wreck his plan in some way. It was foreknown. We know that from the scriptures. We also know that the crucifixion of Christ, the atonement for God's elect, was all foreknown by God as well. That was part of the plan. Okay. Thirdly, we know that all people one day, read Psalm 89, all people one day will glorify God when the full plan, the eternal redemptive plan of God is revealed. There will be a day when we look back on this marvelous plan of God and we just explode in praise. This is true. It's also mentioned there in Ephesians chapter 1, verse 10, when it talks about God bringing unity to all things in heaven and on earth under Christ. While we may not know the full answer today, there will be a day when it all makes sense. And if you were given the keys, you were given the pen to write history in any way you want, you would sit down and you would write it exactly as it is being written. That's the doctrine of the sovereignty and marvelous providence of God in the lives that we live. So while not intellectually satisfying, we can rest knowing that this will one day be the case.